So welcome everybody to the colloquium and to hear another great speaker. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Dong Nguyen, who is currently at Utrecht University. She has a really strong history of advancing the state of the art in the area of computational sociolinguistics and computational social science in a number of different areas. And I particularly was influenced by a review article and position paper that she was first author on from 2016 that really sets forth an agenda for computational sociolinguistics that sort of sets the stage for much of the subsequent research in that area. So she's a real pioneer and a towering figure in this area. She also did a master's degree at the LTI. So, you know, this shows where you can go. So please join me in welcoming Dong Nguyen.
Well, thanks for the very nice invitation to be able to speak here. So, yes, I used to be a master's student here at LTI. I left in 2011, 2012. And this is the first time that I'm back in Pittsburgh. So it has been really nice. Yesterday I did a lot of walking in Squirrel Hill, where I used to live. So it's been nice to visit again. So today I will talk about NLP and language variation. So this is a topic that I've been interested in for quite some time. And actually the first time that I got introduced into sociolinguistics was during my master's here at LTI with Caroline. So thank you, Caroline. And then I worked on different things, but during my PhD I realized that this is actually a topic that I'm very interested in. So I want to talk more about language variation, but I also worked on other topics. I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. So, well, what is language variation? I think many of you probably know what we mean with language variation, but just to illustrate it with a few examples. Right, so it's basically this idea that there are often many different ways to write or say something. We can have lexical variation. I'm going to take the elevator, or I'm going to take the lift. Right? Or morphosyntactic variation. I gave the ball to her, or I gave her the ball. Another example, he is happy, and then word deletion, he happy. And in particular online, or if we are chatting with people or messaging, then we see a lot of spelling variation. So we could have something like, how are you doing? Or G-dropping, which we see in speech, but also we see a lot online. Or something like this, right? Where I think there's a less clear direct relation between variation in speech. So the key thing with variation is that in many cases, it's inherently related to the fact that language is a social practice, right? So, for example, the way I'm speaking right now, it relates to who I am, my background, but also the audience that I'm talking to, right? And so variation is often not noise, but actually meaningful, and that's something that I hope that NLP people would also going to start thinking a bit more about, right? So, in sociolinguistics, for example, language variation has been linked to the age of speakers, or where they are, these broad demographic categories, but also more local attributes like whether someone is cool or easygoing, or whether they live or coming from an urban region, etc. So sociolinguistics is this research field that has existed for a very long time, where they are studying this relation between language and society. And so with a focus on language variation and change. And I'm particularly interested, from my background in NLP and computer science, in computational sociolinguistics, which is kind of this more emerging area where we're looking at computational methods to analyze and model this relation between language and society. And so we wrote this survey article in 2016, which was mentioned, which kind of introduces this area. I think it's a bit outdated by now, but it could still be a good intro into the general topic. So now let's talk about what happens when NLP meets language variation, right? So if you look at NLP, if you look at the research, the tools that are developed, a lot of the work focuses on English. if you take a closer look, actually a lot of the work focuses on what people also sometimes call standard English, right? And so there are a couple of really nice articles kind of reflecting or critiquing this focus of NLP on standard English. For example, we see that a lot of tools, they don't really work well when we use them on different demographic groups. So there's been a lot of work on trying to make NLP more robust against language variation, to make sure it works for lots of different social and demographic groups. What I want to talk about today are a couple of other aspects or reasons that I think we should start thinking more about NLP and language variation. So first of all, by using NLP, we can hopefully build new analysis tools that can help social linguists and social scientists to study language in society in new ways or in more fine-grained ways. And finally, I also think that by incorporating or learning from insights in social linguistics, we can improve our models to be, let's say, more socially aware. So these are the two things that I'd like to talk about today. So first, new analysis tools. I'd like to give two examples of work in this area and then reflect on a couple of challenges. So in social linguistics, a couple of methods to collect data that have been used a lot are, for example, surveys, like asking people how do you refer to particular concepts. Another is observation, so going into the community, for example, and talking and observing members, as well as interviews. Now, one of the biggest challenges is what Labov has also called the observer's paradox, which is that if you're interested in studying this relation between language and society, you ideally want to observe people when they don't know that they're being observed, right? Like when they're talking with family at home or when they're with friends in a pub. But if you ask them to fill in a survey or if you're interviewing them, they know that they are being studied and they often, or there's this risk that they adapt the language to what they think is expected. So therefore, I think these other types of data that are now emerging, like, for example, online data, but also conversational data that gets transcribed, can provide really interesting data sources to complement these data collection methods that I just discussed. Now, the difficulty is that often this data is so big that it's just impossible to manually inspect. So that's one point where NLP can definitely help. But also, sometimes the patterns that we're interested in are so fine-grained that it's not even possible or very difficult to manually identify them. Sometimes you really need to aggregate across thousands of texts to really detect or identify really nuanced patterns. So this is another point where NLP can help. And it could serve as interesting cases that might defy or might not match your expectations. So here's an example of a somewhat older study where we were looking at geographical variation. Right? So there's a lot of work in social linguistics trying to understand how language varies geographically. And an important step is identifying linguistic features that vary geographically, like particular words or particular grammatical constructions. Often this is based on knowledge about the language or intuitions from the researcher, but is often quite limited in terms of which linguistic features people look at. So we were interested in, well, can we automatically identify linguistic features that varies geographically? And we framed this as this kind of hypothesis testing problem. So is there dependence between X, which are the feature values? So this could be the presence or absence of a particular word, or the relative frequencies, and Y, the locations. And the locations could be like counties or even GPS locations. These could be really fine-grained geospatial information. And a null hypothesis would be that there's no spatial dependence, right? And so in this particular work, we explore different methods to do this, based on machine learning, for example, and kernel methods. And here's just one example of a figure that shows quite a clear pattern, which is from the Netherlands, where there are kind of two different ways to refer to French fries. And we see that the colors, there's quite a difference between the south of the Netherlands and the north of the Netherlands, where in the south of the Netherlands people would use, for example, friet, and the north of the Netherlands would use patat. Right? So this is a figure where it's quite clear but in many other figures, it's not as clear, and a method like this could help. So let's continue. I actually think I will skip a few slides and then just start in the next section, because that will be the main part of this talk, if no time. So, okay. So now I want to focus on the second point that I mentioned, and I want to think a bit more about representation learning and NLP models and language variation. So there's been a lot of work in NLP on developing representations, right? And so one of the key questions is well, what aspects of meaning should these representations encode? So one aspect that I think is really interesting or important is something that has been overlooked so far, I think, in NLP. So there's increasing awareness that we need to look at the social aspect of language in representation learning, right? So there are a couple of papers also here from people at CMU kind of drawing attention to the fact that, that the social nature of language is really important. Now, what I think has been overlooked is this concept of social meaning, which is really important in social linguistics. So social meaning is the fact that differences in linguistic forms of variation, they can potentially carry information about the social identity of the speaker. And this could be really broad categories like which region someone is from or someone's age, but it could also be really these highly localized identities. And social meaning is not fixed, so particular linguistic forms, they can carry potentially a broader set of social meanings. So this is called the indexical field. And depending on the specific context, that variant or this linguistic form then can carry a particular social meaning. And social meaning is associated with different types of linguistic forms, like pronunciation, lexicon, morphosyntactic, spelling, etc. Right, so if you think about this in terms of representations, then this is one example to illustrate this, right? So we have different forms, for example, of spelling doing, right? We could have the standard or the conventional form, we could have G-dropping, we could have lengthening, etc. And so then the question is, what should these representations look like for these different forms of spelling doing? Well, we could say, well, it should capture the fact that it's a verb, etc., etc. But if we would give all these representations if we could give all these linguistic forms exactly the same representation, then we would lose this rich social meaning that is associated with different ways of writing or saying, right? So if for all these different forms of doing, the representations would look exactly the same, we miss this social meaning that comes with these different variants. So there's this paper in 2021 where we kind of describe or introduce this concept of social meaning to NLP people in collaboration with two social linguists. So if you're interested in this topic, then I think this paper might be something to look at. So there is some work on, for example, encouraging representations of different spelling variants to be close to each other, right, to make models more robust. And this might be totally fine for certain applications, but it also resembles text normalization to some extent, because you're kind of removing this rich social information that comes with different ways of writing or speaking. So why does this matter? Well, for example, our conversational systems or text generation, right? You might want to make systems that can write in consistent styles or that adapt the language to who they're talking to. For all these different cases, social meaning is relevant. And also for computational social linguistics, where we're interested in exploring questions about language and society, if we would be able to learn representations that can that can capture social meaning, I think this could open up a lot of interesting research questions. So fully learning and representing the rich social meanings of language is incredibly difficult. Depending on your definition of social meaning, it might even be impossible. But even small steps in this direction, I think, could already benefit many NLP applications and support new directions in social science research. Now, a couple of challenges in social linguistics. The vast majority of work has focused on speech data. So we know a lot about social meaning in speech, but actually there's very little work on looking at social meaning and variation in text. So this is something that I found very challenging, because if you want to, for example, probe NLP models or evaluate them and compare them with, for example, insights from social linguistics, there's not a lot to draw on if you're interested in text variation. And social meaning is highly contextual. So this raises questions like, well, what context should these computational models encode or include? And it also brings challenges for collecting evaluation data. So today I want to talk about studies that we did recently, where we just started to think about, well, what do current web stations or NLP models do in terms of encoding language variation? So this is really a first step towards this more long-term goal of encoding or learning social meaning. So I want to focus on spelling variation and stylistic variation. So first I'd like to talk about spelling variation, which is joint work with Jack Grieve and Laura Rossiu. So first of all, we like to understand, well, what social meanings are associated with spelling variation, right? So for example, if you read a message like this, what does it tell you about the speaker versus a message like this where you have like a G dropping? And as I mentioned, there's a lot of work on speech and social meaning, but not a lot of work on text and social meaning. So together with Laura, we've been looking at adapting the speaker evaluation paradigm in social linguistics to work with text data. So basically the idea is that you in speech, that people listened to different speech fragments, for example, with different accents, and then they're asked about the impressions of the speaker, and we're trying to do something similar with text. Right, so this is a recent study which is still in a pilot phase, where we show people different tweets, some tweets with the standard spelling or conventional spelling, and some tweets with specific spelling variants, and then we ask people to write down words that come to mind. So this could be an example, right? So you could have a tweet like this, what have you done, where the E is lengthened at the end. Right, so maybe I can ask you, right, like what would be your impression about this person based on if you read a tweet like this? And there's no correct answer because everyone has different perceptions, right? So, right?
I was going to say it seems like they're kind of whining.
Whining, okay. Someone else?
I'd say they're more likely to be younger. Maybe
Younger?
Older.
Yeah.
I think they might be trying to be humorous.
Humorous. Yeah.
I think they might also be more likely to be female than male.
Female, male. All right, and what about this one? Where the final G's drop, just doing my job.
They're trying to signal informality.
Informality, okay. Yeah. Right, so we did this on a larger scale. So this is still a pilot study, what I'm showing you here. But we did this with Polyfic, which is a crowdsourcing platform. And we had 120 participants looking at these tweets. And we had these kind of open questions to start off with, right? Like, do you sometimes have intuitions or expectations about someone based on how they use spelling on platforms like Twitter? And here you see a range of different responses, right? Like here, this person says, yes, I do. For example, if someone uses a lot of emojis, I tend to think that they're very energetic and forward, or this person hates bad spelling. And then there's this response that shows also that it's very contextual, right? Like, at least this person doesn't like it if businesses on Twitter use these kind of spelling variations. So here are the responses for these different types of spelling variation, and I think they quite match with what you have said. So, for example, for lengthening, annoyed, which is a bit like whining maybe, young, fun, female. So I think that matches quite with what some of you also have said. And what we generally see is that responses are both about the writer of a tweet as well as about the text itself, right? Like whether the text is informal or formal, and the wider in terms of age or, for example, whether someone is excited or focused and so on. And what I think is important to highlight is that in many cases you see both negative and positive perceptions. So the main point here is just to show you that, for example, spelling variation is not just noise or just random, right? Like we have impressions about people based on how they write. So many spelling variants that we see online are not just misspellings. So if there's one thing that you remember from the talk, I think this might be such a thing, right? So a lot of times we see that people actually deliberately deviate from conventional spelling norms to create social meaning. And so depending on the NLP application, it might therefore not be desirable to map all these spelling variants to the same point in the embedding space. So the study that we first started off with, and this is really like a first step in this direction, is just to understand, do current word embeddings encode or capture spelling variation? So this was trained on two different data sets, a Twitter data set and a Reddit data set. And here's just to illustrate it using one example where we see different spelling variants for the word nothing. And this is trained on Reddit data using the ScriptGAN model. And so the ScriptGAN model is not using the spelling of the words. But still, if you look at where the words are positioned in a space, I do think that the structure is, well, it suggests that it's encoding something about variation, right? We see lengthened forms close to each other, even though ScriptGAN is not using the spelling of the words to learn representations. We see the conventional spelling of nothing close to misspellings, or what seem to be misspellings of nothing. And here we see these forms that reflect more dialectal pronunciations. And even within this larger cluster, we see a smaller cluster that is more like each other. Right. So we wanted to study this in a more systematic way. And so what we did was we looked at different types of spelling variation, and we created pairs of conventional and non-conventional forms. Right, so for example, with lengthening, we have these pairs where we have a conventional form spelling like ants and a lengthened form of ants. And we have swapping of characters, common misspellings, G-dropping, vowel omission, substituting characters, as well as British versus American spelling. We use different heuristics to create these pairs, and then we manually filtered out the cases that were not real cases of spelling variation. Because otherwise you might get pairs like kin and king, which is just G-dropping, but is not really G-dropping. Agreement was quite high, although there were also difficult cases, especially because here we're looking at individual words. So then there are these things like planting and planting. Is planting a case of G-dropping, or is it a misspelling of plantain? Right? It's difficult to say. So just to illustrate that spelling variation is not just distributed randomly, right? So this is on the Reddit data, where we looked at how these different types of spelling variations are distributed across the different subreddits. So for example, G-dropping is used relatively a lot in especially teenagers, new and Kanye subreddits, and very little in legal advice and change my view. Nearby character substitution, also teenagers, new and drugs, and then bottom subreddits, transcribes of Reddit and Tesla Motors, and then British versus American spelling are in the subreddits that we would expect to be have high use of American or British spelling. Now the key point here is that these different types of spelling variations are not just distributed randomly across these subreddits, right? We see that they're used in particular contexts by particular people. So what happens then if we train word embeddings on, for example, this Reddit data or on Twitter data? So this was an experiment with static word embeddings where we looked at ScriptGAN and fast text, which is very similar, but ScriptGAN doesn't take spelling into account and fast text does. That's the key difference. And then we did a bunch of experiments, all from different perspectives, trying to analyze this. I'm just going to illustrate or show you one figure, but there are more in the paper. right? So one thing that we did was looking at these analogies, which has been used a lot. It has some limitations as well. But the idea is that we have these pairs of words, for example, with G-dropping, and then the question is, can we recover the conventional form based on this analogy setup? So in this case, can we recover walking with a G based on this analogy? And then we control it or compare it against a setting where we just have the non-conventional form and then we turn the nearest neighbors. And then if we see a large performance difference, that suggests that in the embedding space, there's something there that relates to this to spelling variation. So here are the results for G-dropping. So we had 2 different data sets, Reddit and Twitter, 2 different models, skipgram and fast text, and then 2 settings. One, the control setting, which contains, which are the dotted lines, and the analogy setting, which are the solid lines. Right. So we do see that the analogy setting improves quite a lot over the control setting. And you can see this if you compare the dotted lines with the solid lines in the same color. And I think this is especially interesting for skipgram, because skipgram is not using the spelling of the words at all when learning embeddings. And still, it seems to encode some of the structure in the embeddings. Fast text does particularly well on G-dropping, which is expected because fast text does take the spelling of words into account. But it was still good to see this also in the figure. We did many more experiments. You can look at it in a paper. But I think if there's 1 or 2 key points to remember from this particular study, is that we should think about whether we would want all different variants, all different spelling variants, for example, to be mapped to the same point in the embedding space. So my take is that in many cases, especially if we're interested in the social aspects of language, this is actually undesirable. But I think it's good to actively make that choice, right? Whether that's relevant for your application or goal or not. And this study was really a first step towards understanding how spelling variants are represented. Now I want to talk about more recent work on stylistic variation with Anna Wegman and Marijn Schagen. And here the goal is very similar, that we're trying to understand or measure the quality of representations in terms of whether they are able to encode style. So style is a very difficult concept because there are many different definitions for style. But broadly, you can think of it as how things are said versus what is said, right? And style is relevant for, again, analysis of conversations or general natural language understanding, but also for generating text. There's quite a lot of work on, can we preserve styles, for example, when we generate text, or the dialogue agents needs to portray a consistent identity, and so therefore have to talk in consistent style. So in this particular study, we want to develop a framework to measure whether representations or NLP models encode style. And it turned out that it was quite difficult, at least, to do this, at least more difficult than I expected. So first, here are the challenges. First, there's this correlation between style and content. So people talk in different styles, but we also talk differently depending on the specific topics that we're talking about, the specific settings, right? So we talk more formally in a job application, for example, than when we're at the pub. So it's not only going to differ in terms of style, but it's also going to differ in terms of the topics that we talk about. So that's a strong correlation between style and content in practice. Also, the current evaluation methods that have been developed are often quite task-specific, which involves training or fine-tuning models on a specific task, like style classification or authorship attribution. And we want to develop a framework that's a bit more general, where you don't need to retrain or fine-tune a model. And then, as I mentioned, it's challenging because there are many different style definitions. Here's one by Biber, where it's really about aesthetic preferences. Here's one which is more from a sociolinguistic viewpoint, that style is a socially meaningful clustering of features. But our take was that we don't want to choose one particular definition of style. We kept it quite broad, and depending on your own definition of style, you can then exclude or include particular test cases. So that's why we want to have it to be quite modular. So the framework that we proposed is controlling for content or topics using paraphrases, and it's actually based on measuring on similarities, so that any method that can be used to calculate style similarity could be could be tested with this framework. And then it's modular, as I mentioned, so you can include or exclude particular test cases depending on your specific definition of style. So this is how it looks like. We have two different pairs of sentences. We have an anchor pair and another sentence pair. So here, each pair is a paraphrase of each other. So the anchor pair is a paraphrase, and then the second sentence is also a paraphrase pair. And then the task is to look at the style of the messages. So here, for example, we see that A1 is more informal than A2, if you, for example, look at the spelling. And S2 is more informal than S1. So the model should decide, do sentences S1 and S2, do they match in terms of style order of A1 and A2? That's the task. In this case, the answer is no, because A1 is more informal than A2, but S2 is more informal than S1. And by using paraphrases, the idea is that the model can't rely on, let's say, topical signals or something else, but should really focus on the style of the messages to do the task. Is the task clear, or are there any questions? Right, okay. So we included different stylistic dimensions in this framework, but you can also expand it, right, by creating more test cases. So we looked at formal, informal, simple versus complex, and then we had two really specific dimensions to test for particular features like substituting characters for numbers and contraction. So we built on these existing data sets that have been available already. So for formal and informal, we used this data set that was generated from Yahoo Answers. So then you have pairs like this, right, like I showed you before. For simple and complex, we also use this existing data set which is generated from Wikipedia data, where Pittsburgh, so actually I've been using this slide multiple times, so Pittsburgh is a coincidence, and it's a different spelling, but where located is considered to be more complex than in, for example. Right, so here is another example of the task, just to make sure that it's clear, right? So we have an anchor pair and another sentence pair, and then the question is, do sentence 1 and sentence 2 match the style order of anchor 1 and anchor 2? So what do you think? Just to make sure you can do the same task as we ask the NLP models to do. Who wants to do a guess? Yes?
Yes, that's right.
Yes, and why?
Both of the ones on the left are more formal use, more complicated. Yeah.
And why are they more formal?
The vocabulary.
Vocabulary. Yeah. 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 Correct? Right? So, yeah, just looking at vocabulary like remained versus stayed or became defunct and stopped, etc. Here's another dimension that we included in the framework, which is number substitution. So things like forever and then this alternative way of spelling forever, like forever with the number 4. And these were cases that we generated from a Reddit data set. And then we had contraction, which is like it's and it has. So these are just very specific cases to illustrate that the framework can also check for these really specific features if you're interested in that. So the first two are more difficult. and the last two are more easier. But just to illustrate, that's modular, so you can also add or remove cases or dimensions that you might or might not consider to be stale. We generated the test instances by first having this data set with paraphrases, and then just randomly selecting the anchor pairs and the other sentence pair and randomly swapping them. And then we noted that there was still quite some noise in the data sets that we used, because we used these existing data sets. So we did an additional filtering step using crowdsourcing. So this is the final data set that we had with these 4 dimensions. And here are some of the results that we had, right? So this is the performance on all different dimensions, and these are the performances on the individual dimensions. What matched our intuition and what we also saw in the results is that the informal formal dimension is easier than a simple complex dimension. If you look at the performance, overall the performance on formal, informal is higher than simple complex. The 2 dimensions at the end, number substitution and contraction, were easier by design, and there we also see that the numbers are generally much higher. And finally, we found that the BERT-based methods actually perform quite well already, although there's still a lot of room for improvements. And that casing is important because the cased versions, they perform a little bit better than the uncased versions. And also a simple baseline where we just look at the fraction of capitalized letters already improved on, let's say, just the random performance. Thanks. And finally, word length was also relevant, especially for the simple complex dimension. So to summarize, this is a general kind of task setup or framework that you can use to test either representations or any NLP model, as long as you can measure the similarity between text according to style. Right? And we included 80 models in the paper, and for future work, we would be interested in adding additional dimensions, like individual author styles, for example, or demographic groups. It's very flexible, and you can create any dimension that you're interested in. And also, we focused on short text, but in general, this could also be applied to longer text. And now I want to talk about more recent work that was published at a workshop recently, but we still have quite some ideas on how to improve it, which is really learning these style representations, right? So if we have these different text fragments, and then we would want texts that are more similar in terms of style to be closer to each other in the embedding space than text that is different, more different in style. So here, both lowercase as well as G-dropping, and this sentence, how are you doing, is perhaps semantically more similar to this one, but if we're interested in style, it actually is less similar. So the training task is based on this idea of idiolects, that everyone has this unique way of writing or speaking. And this idea has also been very influential in the field of authorship verification and authorship identification. So there's some recent work looking at representation learning and how, for example, authorship verification tasks can be used to learn author representations or style representations. So we drew inspiration from this, and this is how the training task looked like. For each text, the only thing that we need is to have the authors of the text, author IDs. Right? And then we have an anchor text, in this case written by author A. And then we have other text, either texts that are written by the same author, an example is U2, or texts that are written by different authors, so U1. Right? And then the idea is that texts that are written by the same author, they should have a higher similarity in the embedding space than texts that are written by different authors, based on these assumptions that different authors have different ways of writing. Now, the nice thing is that it's easy to generate many, many training examples to learn these neural models, as long as you have a data set where authorship information comes quite naturally. The drawback, of course, is that this assumption doesn't always hold, right? Like we often shift in terms of style, for example, depending on who we're talking to. But still, I think it's fair to say that if you just take random pairs of text written by different people, then it's likely that they are less similar in terms of style than if we take text written by the same author. Now, the challenge here is that we not only have different authors, but individuals also don't just talk about every topic, right? We usually talk about a small subset of topics. So it could be the case that author A usually talks about food, for example, and author B usually talks about sports. So then a model could actually learn this task by leveraging these topical signals. If the two pairs of text are both about food, then perhaps it's just more likely that they're written by the same author. So we would want to discourage the model to focus on these, let's say, content or topical signals, because we really want the models to learn style or to focus on style. So therefore, we try to make the task more difficult by controlling or trying to control for topic at different levels. So one of the levels that we looked at was controlling it at the conversational level. So in this case, the two pairs that are written by the same author are coming from different conversations. Well, actually, the pairs that are written by different authors are coming from the same conversation. And so this discourages the model to use these more topical signals to do the task. Now, we tried different variants of this setup using both contrastive and triplet laws, and we used the Reddit data to learn these representations. And in Reddit, I think it's nice because we have conversational data and we have author IDs. So we evaluate the model on this style task that I described before, right? So we have these two paraphrases, and then the model should decide whether the texts are in the same style order as the anchor pair. But what we noticed that with this task is that you need to be able to encode style information to do this task, but the model might still encode other aspects of meaning. Right? That's fine for this task. But we also wanted to check whether the model is really prioritizing style over other aspects of meaning, because we really want to learn style representations. So we came up with this variant where we removed one of the texts, and then we moved A2 to here. And then given an anchor text like A1, we want to know which of these two texts is more similar to A1. So if we're interested in style, the correct answer should be S2, because they're both informal. But then there's this other text that is a paraphrase of A1. So this is a very difficult task for models, because most of the models that focus on semantic content, they would definitely choose A2. Right? So this is a very, very difficult task, but it allows us to really test what is prioritized, style or more semantic aspects of meaning. So here are the results. So if you look at the style or content task that I just described, then the models that we trained are doing much better on it compared to just a plain Roberta model. However, so that does suggest that these more fine-tuned models focus more on style. Unfortunately, on this framework that we originally proposed, the style framework, the models performed actually slightly worse. So it suggests that perhaps some style information got lost, maybe. We particularly saw a drop in the performance on the number substitution dimension. That might have had an impact. And we also noticed that there were still a bit of noise in the evaluation instances when we looked at the data more closely, even after filtering in a simple complex dimension. But this is still some more follow-up work that's needed to really understand what happened there, if I'm honest. But I think these results were quite encouraging to see that at least for that particular task, the models really seem to focus more on style than semantic aspects. The model is also on Hugging Face, so you can try it out if you want. So here are just a couple of examples. We have the source sentence, "This is nice," where nice is lengthened and in lowercase. And then you do see that something like a sentence, "Cool, when are you coming?" when cool is lengthened, has a much higher similarity than, for example, "This is nice" written in the more standardized spelling. We also noticed that the model is very sensitive towards capitalization. So in the paper we did a bit more systematic analysis, but here, for example, you see if the source sentence is fully capitalized, then another sentence which is fully capitalized has a much higher similarity than, for example, the same sentence in lowercase. So the models that is trained on this authorship task really learns to focus on capitalization as one of the aspects. And finally, it also, to some extent, learns like British versus American lexical forms. Right. So to summarize the challenges in terms of looking at STEL, I think is evaluation. So evaluation turns out to be very difficult. We came up with 2 different ways to test the models, but still there's quite some noise also in the test instances. And then taking a broader step, STEL is generally about how things are said versus what. And so ideally you want to keep the what, the content or semantic information constant. But is it even possible, right? If you look at our data, many of the paraphrases are not exactly the same in terms of meaning, right? So is it even possible? Is it even needed? We're still not sure. But I think that is one of the biggest challenges if you're working with STEL and NLP, I would say. So some final thoughts. I hope that at least from this talk you are a little bit more excited about language variation than before. Language variation is everywhere. It's not just noise. It carries a lot of social information. And it also allows us to better understand and analyze social phenomena. So I hope that if you're working on your own task, you could think about, well, to what extent does language variation play a role? And I would be really excited to see more NLP models looking at social context and variation. So thank you. That's it.
Some time for a few questions.
So you talked a lot about how kind of like variations in spelling can imply things about the identities of speakers. But especially in online contexts, I think that there are a lot of instances where people code switch to express identities differently. And I'm wondering, how do you think about the role of like personas versus identity in your work? And additionally, like, have you kind of considered modeling communicative intent with personas and identities?
These are really good questions. So in terms of identity, at least how I understand it from social linguistics is that it doesn't assume that we have this like fixed identity, right? Like it's very contextual and you can really shift depending on a lot of different things. So I think that would actually be nice that if we would able to model this, then I think that also would allow us to go a bit further from these broad demographic groups that people have done so far with NLP, right? So I think this would allow us to have this more fine-grained and more flexible identity work if we would able to go in this direction. Your second question was about, sorry.
Explicitly modeling the kind of communicative
Yeah.
as a reason for adopting personas.
So I think it would be really interesting. I haven't done work on it yet, but I do think that because a lot of this. So I think it's very difficult to say to some extent, also with spelling variation, if it's intentional or not. Even sometimes some of these what appear to be mistakes are not mistakes, but actually on purpose. Like one of my co-authors, Jack Grieve, he really makes a point of it that there are these words where 2 characters are swapped, it looks like a mistake, and then if you look close at the data, it seems that they're doing it intentionally to mark a specific thing, right? So I think it would be really interesting to look at intent, also very difficult. So I've been trying to stay a little bit away from claiming whether a particular variation is intentional or not, but I think it would be great, perhaps also in lab studies and in other contexts, to look at this more. Yeah. Yeah.
On the topic of intent, maybe one thing you could do is sort of expand the context that you're
Yeah.
looking at for given sentences, like in certain types of variation tend to appear in very similar contexts, either like before in the comment chain that led to that variation or in the result of
Yeah.
the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? Like looking at history and see if it deviates also at the individual level, right? Like this person always talks in this way, and now this person talks suddenly in a very different way. That might, I don't know, maybe that might suggest some intention there. Yeah.
By
intent, do you mean like specifically signaling some additional meaning through taking the example of switching characters, or that expressing some sort of like language variety variation, in that it's the way I saw it spelled growing up and I spell it this way, or it's the way I'm used to spelling it and I spell it this way, versus I am trying to communicate the specific like aspects of
Yeah.
each one of these are you referencing?
So I think there are a lot of different reasons that people could write in different ways or show language variation, right? So what I particularly like about spelling variation is that it's so visible, especially things like lengthening or number substitution. Well, it's visible to people, right? Also to the author. Well, with some other forms, it might be even more difficult, I think, to say whether it's intentional or not. But yeah, there are a lot of different reasons that people can, like, for example, if I'm talking to someone, I might consciously or unconsciously adapt my style towards this other person because I want this person to like me. Right, there are a lot of different reasons. Yeah.
One thing, so I like the categories you have, like G dropping,
Yeah.
vowel,
Yeah.
elongation, and things like that. And I was thinking about the examples you gave, like girl spelled without the U, and like the like multiple vowels. And I feel like when I see text like that, I often like play it in my head and like imagine what it would be like to sound it out, and then I extract some like thing from what that audio would be, like in what context you would say that in that way. And so I guess my question is, like, have you thought about doing this with the audio modality as well as the text modality? And if so, like, how do you collect the data for that?
I haven't looked at speech yet. I think it will be very interesting. There is some other work, for example, by Jacob Eisenstein that looked at also specific types of variation. And there he found that when people were using these variants in text, it was very similar to what people have observed in speech. So he found quite a strong link between variation in speech and variation in text. Now, there are also typical types of variation in text that I don't think there's immediately a clear counterpart in speech. And so for these things, I think there's less knowledge or less insight about how they are used. But one thing that's with the social linguists that I'm looking at these perception studies, one of the things that we would be interested in is also kind of making this distinction between types of variations that also have been used in speech versus ones that are really specific to text, and also see if there are differences there. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, so I feel like some low resource languages have maybe like 8 different orthography systems.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of variation, maybe in ways that English doesn't even display variation. I was just wondering if you know of work that's involved in that, because I feel like capturing that variation is vital to even understanding what someone's saying in a lot of languages like that.
I think there's quite some work looking at other languages than English that also have fewer resources. But in terms of learning representations, I haven't seen that type of work yet. I think, but there's definitely work on identifying dialect features, for example, in smaller languages. Or like I had a study some time ago where we looked at minority languages in the Netherlands, where also we don't have many speakers, but there we were just looking at when a person is using that particular minority language. So just the choice of language, where I think you don't need a lot of data to do it. So I think it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish, how much data you need, right? But I would love to see more work on these type of languages, yeah.
The Reddit example was really interesting, and like I guess like reflects people's identities, like British versus American. I was wondering, like, if you could also analyze how like people adjust kind of norms in the community. Is there kind of like enough data in Reddit that you could like see when someone joins and how kind of their language changes?
Well, I think we have a student here who does some of that work. But there's quite some work on looking at how people adjust their language to either communities or within conversations to other people. But so far, a lot of that work has been on like the lexical level, like specific sets of words, like function words or particular style words. And I would be really interested, or one of the motivations to look at these representations is that I think we can measure star accommodation, for example, on a much finer grain level if we could have these high quality representations, right? Because a lot of these metrics are quite coarse-grained because they are defined on looking at part of speech tagging or something. Yeah.
So I have a question that kind of relates to Daniel's question, kind of relates to one of Sarisha's question at the beginning, which is like at analyzing things at the level of variation versus interaction. So a lot of what you've presented here today seems kind of variationist in some sense, like you're looking at people in a somewhat static way as having certain demographic characteristics. But you know, a lot of other sociolinguists have looked at identity as something that evolves through time, you know, and that is very contextual, which you mentioned, of course. So I guess my question is, to what extent can you adapt the techniques that you've outlined today to like a more interactionist paradigm, and to what extent the questions become different if you do that?
So I would love to take this more interactive perspective. I guess we're just really starting from the easiest setup that we could imagine. Just to get started, right? But for example, also with experiments where we ask people to read tweets and then describe what they think about that person, we really remove all the context that there is, right? We could have shown much more context because we actually know that people might give different answers depending on whether they know if it's a business account or not, or if they see some profile information. But I've discussed it quite a lot also with my collaborator, and we decided to really go to the most simple setting to start off with. But I would love to take more context into account, and then also look at this interactive setting and look at like when do people style shifts, like, or when do they use a particular feature. I think it's very challenging, like depending on the specific definition also. I think some of the definitions that people take are almost impossible to formalize almost, right? Like the third wave social linguistics is really like, very difficult, I think.
You know, but it does seem that there are things like you've suggested and like been suggested today. There are avenues where you could look, you know, at evolution of like a user within a Twitter or a Reddit subreddit or whatever over time, and like contextual kinds of adjustments in terms of what forms they're using and so on. And it seems like that would be like to me, like that would be a nice like thing to see building on this existing kind of work, which is very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that I would be really excited about is to really think about the context that we give to these NLP models, right? Like social context, and I think the question there is also how much social context do we need, because if you ask a social linguist, almost everything is relevant, right? So what is practical, what is really needed, like where can we find the balance? I think these are really interesting questions that I would love to think about and see more. And so I think in general, I hope that this kind of work would also help us to kind of move away from this assumption that everyone has this kind of fixed identity, kind of losing the agency of people, right? And taking this more interactive approach.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question.
No.
I was wondering if you saw any like specific words or like set of words that are more commonly have variations in. Like for example, if I like use LMAO and like all caps, then that means I feel like that signals more in social settings than like if I use like LMAO with like a lot of O stronger social signal than like if I use something else and use different variation of the word? Like, have you?
Right. So you're asking if particular features carry stronger signals than other. My intuition would be yes, right? But I don't think we have the numbers yet because it's like a pilot study that I would be hesitant to say, to make claims about it. But yeah.
Okay, let's give